Hi, and welcome to Leadership Influence for Internal Communication Specialists, Session 1, which is all about starting from the right place. We are your host, Russell Olivier Brooklands, and yeah, you did just hear that right. Why is this guy referring to himself in the plural? Well, because we have a rare form of neurodivergence, which means that our body actually works better when we do that. Nothing more spectacular than that, but it does also mean that we're pretty good, because of the way our mind processes the world, at seeing things that other people very often miss, which can be very useful when it comes to leadership influence. As for our sort of reasons for sharing these ideas with you, our background is, well, we've been an internal communication specialist for, well, 30 years or so. We actually started out as a brand manager for Zurich Insurance, but that meant we got responsibility for establishing language standards for the company, which meant we got more and more interested in how internal communication was affected by language. And we set up on our own in 1996 as a consultant and trainer, bringing specialist skills and insights to internal communication teams. So we've been doing it a long time. Over that time, we've worked with all sorts of organizations in the corporate sector, like Lloyds Banking Group, GlaxoSmithKline, Airbus, and in the public sector with GCHQ at the heart of the British security establishment, the European Central Bank, and the United Nations. So we've been around the block quite a few times, and we can probably, we hope, share some useful ideas with you. But what sort of ideas might you find useful? Well, because this is about leadership influence, it's probably a good idea to think about what kind of influence you would like and what challenges you currently have with the influence maybe you don't have. So here's just a list of what we would describe as sort of influence poverty. Things which are sort of frustrations and niggles and why do I have to's and if onlys and all that sort of thing, which may drive you nuts. And if you like, you can sort of take a screen grab of this and refer to it later. And if you look through this list, you may find that you recognize maybe just one or two, maybe you recognize half of them, or a lot of people, when we share this list with them, they sort of look at us and say, do you work here? You know, they do sort of have a little bit of a brain freeze and think, this guy must know, he knows something. How can he be so on the nose with so many of the things that are challenging us? But not everyone recognizes all of them. But whatever you recognize, maybe you could add to this list with issues that you've got as well, so that you're clear about, oh, these are the things which, if I didn't have this influence poverty, as it were, I would be able to really have, a great time doing my job and be making so much of a contribution. But what would that flip side actually look like? Where do you really want to get to? This is perhaps a useful thing to get clear about before going any further. What is the promise of these 3 sessions that we're going to take you through? Where could you be if you had an abundant amount of influence? What sort of things would you be able to do? How brilliant could your working life be? How much more expansive could your career get? How much more valuable could you be to the people who employ you, and so on? How much more fulfillment could you have from your job? And so again, if you want to take a screen grab of this, it might be interesting to consider, is this kind of where you would like to get to, whatever your current influence poverty may be? Are these the kinds of things you would like to have instead? Being able to establish or influence business policies for the way IC is practiced, getting called in on projects with enough time to add maximum value, all of these really juicy, groovy things that perhaps you might like to be able to do. This is where we're going to be able to get you over the course of these 3 sessions. So before we get stuck into the content, it's probably a good idea to just do a little bit of sort of housekeeping, a little bit of scene setting, because what we're going to be talking about throughout these sessions, given the way our mind processes the world differently, we are able to identify a phenomenal number of what we might describe as blind spots. Now, because we are very into DEI ourselves, given the nature of how we work, then we were a little bit concerned about, might people be a bit concerned about the word blind spots? Is that a little bit something that people could get upset about? So we checked with a mate of ours who is visually impaired, and he kind of looked at us and he smiled. In fact, he laughed and he said, "What's the problem?" And so we think, yeah, okay, because a blind spot from a physiological perspective, it's just a natural thing. If you put a dot on a piece of card and move it across your eye line, you'll find it disappears and then reappears again, because it's something to do with the way the the optic nerve connects with the back of the eyeball or something. So blind spots are a perfectly natural thing for anybody to have. And what we're talking about here are really psychological blind spots. We're talking about things that not only do people not know, but then they're not even realizing they don't know. They're just not paying attention to and don't realize they're not paying attention to, which is where an awful lot of the challenges with leadership influence can come from if you're an internal communication specialist. So we will be working through a whole series of different blind spots. Now, we have identified, if you like, 3 different types of blind spot that people can have. There may well be more, but these 3 are useful for a starting point. The first of which is what we call the innocent blind spot. Now, this is where people are completely new to a situation, so much so that they not only don't know what's going on, they don't even realize they don't know what's going on. They don't even know what questions to ask because they don't know what it is they don't know. And that can be, you know, problematic in itself, especially if it encounters the second type of blind spot, the expert blind spot. And this can happen when people know a subject so well that there are things that they no longer even occurs to them to mention to anyone else. So they're not even thinking to mention to the innocent people the stuff that, you know, the experts actually know. And of course, the innocents don't know to ask the experts about it because they don't know it's even there. And we've got a huge black hole, which can cause all sorts of problems. And this becomes even more challenging when we encounter the third type of blind spot, which is what we could call the cultural blind spot. Now, there are 2 types of cultural blind spot, really. There are things that kind of nobody knows and we kind of know we don't know them, like, you know, how do dreams really work? What's going on beneath the clouds of Neptune? How do people achieve spontaneous remissions from cancer? These are things that people just know they don't know. But then there's an awful lot of other things that are simply stuff that people have taken for granted without really bothering to question them. And that's what's going on with an awful lot of leadership influence that internal communication specialists don't have. It's very often as a result of them simply not paying attention to things that they've just taken for granted, things that they've just inherited from those who came before them. And so we will start with a little bit of a rethink of a classic piece of Chinese philosophy. You are probably very familiar with this famous old aphorism that a journey of 1,000 miles begins with the first step. Well, yeah, and people just take that for granted. Yeah, of course it is, without realizing that actually there are a couple of blind spots in there. We would say that a journey of 1,000 miles begins productively with the first step, as long as that first step is in the right direction. Otherwise, you're in danger of turning it into a journey of 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 miles and wasting huge amounts of time and energy and possibly money and effort and whatever in the process. So, you know, we need to make sure that the first step is in the right direction. But that gets even more interesting if we then take something from Irish philosophy, if you want to think of it that way. There's a famous old Irish sort of folk story joke, whatever, call it what you will. You may be familiar with it. If you are, then you'll know it's very, very short. And if you're not, we'll just explain. It concerns an Englishman who's lost in the middle of rural Ireland. He's trying to make his way to Dublin, but he hasn't got a clue where he is or which way to turn. So he goes up to one of the locals and says to them, "Excuse me, can you tell me how to get to Dublin from here?" And the Irish fella just looks at him and says, "If I were going to Dublin, I wouldn't start from here." And therein you have a really interesting challenge for an awful lot of internal communication specialists when it comes to trying to establish all the influence they want. Because there's a question of, well, hang on a second, where are you actually starting from? And are you starting from the most useful place you could? Because it seems perfectly understandable that an awful lot of people would start on their journey to leadership influence essentially from wherever their predecessors left off. You know, why wouldn't you do that? Because whenever you became an internal communication specialist or whenever you even started at work, there would have been an internal communication paradigm already set up, wouldn't there? There'd have been, you know, the internal communication team would have been of a certain size. It would have had a certain remit. There were certain subjects that were talked about, maybe others that weren't. There might well have been a corporate tone of voice, which might or might not have been formally documented. No doubt email overload might already have been a thing. And there would have been probably employee surveys in which people were giving their opinions about what they thought of internal communication. So all of those things would probably already have been in place. And it would have been perfectly understandable if that, when you became an internal communication specialist, was where you started on your journey to get all the leadership influence you wanted. The question is, though, Has it worked? Quite possibly not. And there may be quite a number of reasons why, because of all sorts of blind spots that could be stopping that approach from working. And we'll work through quite a number of those over the course of this session and then the next two as well. But one of the things that might be a problem is the fact that, well, hang on, if you started from where your predecessors left off, is it not possible that your leaders did pretty much the same thing? That when they started work, there would already have been an internal communication paradigm in place with all of those other things that we've already discussed. And when they joined the board of directors, whether they came straight into your organization at board level or they worked their way up from wherever, then chances are there would have been a paradigm in place, which is where they probably started on their journey to determining how much leadership influence you should have. And because it's very unlikely that all your leaders started at the same place, started in the same organization, not only may their definition of internal communication influence on the board of directors not necessarily be the same as yours, it's quite possible that none of those leaders actually have the same starting place as each other. So it could be a real mess. So we need to do something about this. We need to bring everyone together so everyone's starting from the same place. And because we are a consultant, we get the opportunity to work with leadership teams in ways which maybe people in-house don't. We get to ask questions. We can get away with asking questions which might be trickier to ask if you're in-house. And so whenever we get the opportunity to sit down with leadership teams, we always start with two questions. And the first question we always ask them is, do you take internal communication seriously? And what do you think they say to that? Of course they say yes. Why wouldn't they? They're hardly going to say, nah, we don't give a monkeys about it. Of course they're going to say they take it seriously. And then very often they'll back that up with a whole series of examples of things they do and things the organization does to prove that they take it seriously. We say, fine, cool, that's brilliant, excellent. Now, question 2, do you take internal communication seriously? Enough. And that's when people's faces fall or they break into these huge smiles because they realize they've just had their bluff called. How on earth is anyone supposed to answer that question? What is seriously enough? Seriously enough for what? And you might say, well, seriously enough to give me all the influence I want. Yeah, well, fair enough. Okay. But if they're not doing that already, why not? What's getting in the way? What's stopping them? And could it be that they simply don't know how to define it for themselves? Could it be that you haven't yet been able to define that for them? And could it be that maybe there's something to do with confidence that's hidden away inside this? Because, well, is it that they don't have enough confidence in you? Is it you don't have enough confidence in yourself? Is it possibly that they don't have enough confidence in themselves to be able to know how much influence they can afford to give you? Oh, what on earth could be going on? We need to dig into confidence right now and understand what might be going on. Because whenever we get called in, or very often when we get called in to help internal communication managers out with their teams, they very often say, I want my team to have more confidence. Well, of course they do. They're hardly going to say, I want my team to be riddled with self-doubt, are they? However, is it actually true that they want their team to have more confidence? Is confidence more of a need than a want, really? Think about it for a second. What would happen if in your job, your confidence just suddenly deserted you? Oh, crikey. Might that lead you into the fight, flight, freeze response? Just go, oh, whoa, what's going on? This is the nature of how confidence works for us humans, which means that if people are put in situations where they're not really sure, is my confidence, can I work? They can very often create different types of what we could call false flag forms of confidence. Perhaps the most famous of them being fake it till you make it. Why would people feel they needed to do that if they actually had the confidence to just do things without faking it? So that's kind of problematic, isn't it? It's hardly a healthy place for anybody to be, because alongside fake it till you make it is quite possibly imposter syndrome. Okay. Well, imposter syndrome is not healthy for either the psychological safety of the person who's, feeling it, or for the well-being of the organization who's got loads of people going around with imposter syndrome inside them who are faking it till they make it because they don't know how to do whatever's being asked of them. So this is a really unhealthy situation for anyone to be in. And it's also problematic for individuals. But what happens when you get groups who aren't necessarily sure of what's going on, whether they're doing things as well as they could? Because we often get involved in project groups where they kind of, are we getting this right? And they're really smart people, really diligent people, and they're doing their best, but they're not really sure if they're getting it right, if this is actually going to work. And so rather than fake it till you make it, for when it's a group situation, very often it can be more a case of just cross your fingers and hope. We hope we're getting this right. We're doing our best and so on. And this is kind of what's going on. Again, it's another way of compensating for the fact that their confidence may not be as great as it could be. And so what's fascinating about this, if we look at this from a leadership perspective, what if your leaders don't know whether or not they can trust you? Do they have the ability to evaluate your skills and your motivations and so on, such that they can give you the influence you want? And if they're not sure about that, how are they going to respond? Well, of course, what's interesting about the way some managers might respond to this situation, if they're not sure about their ability to evaluate the skills and motivations of their people, might this be where micromanaging comes from? Why else would people micromanage if it wasn't for the fact they don't know they can trust their people to deliver? But if you're a business leader and you don't have time to do micromanaging, well, maybe it's just simpler to just clip the wings of the people who you're not sure you know how to micromanage, or whether you can trust them, and all those sorts of things. So maybe that's something that could potentially be going on. Again, we're not saying it is, just saying it's a possibility that might be worth considering. But whatever it is, how do we solve it? How do we actually get through all this false flag confidence? Well, maybe what people actually need is justifiable confidence. That's an interesting thought, isn't it? If you think about yourself and you think about your team, do you have justifiable confidence in everything you're doing? Everything. Maybe, maybe not. Because one of the things that's perhaps important to bear in mind, because justifiable confidence, of course, is built on what we could call a sufficient volume of relevant, credible evidence. How much evidence do you have for different parts of your job that you're doing it as well as you could? Quite possibly you've got plenty in some parts and maybe not so much in others, because the whole thing about justifiable confidence and about fake it till you make it and about cross your fingers and hope is that none of them are absolutes. You know, if you think about it, if someone's faking it till they make it, well, how hard are they having to fake it? How much are they having to fake it? How hard are people having to cross their fingers? How much are they having to hope? If you've got justifiable confidence, how justifiable is it? So these are actually continuums. And if you think about your job, and when we work with internal communication teams, we very often ask the question, well, a couple of questions, really. First of all, are there parts of your job that you enjoy more than others? And people pretty much always say, well, yeah, of course there are. And then we say, okay, so are there parts of your job that you're better at than other parts of your job? And pretty much everyone says, well, yeah, which brings us to a fascinating third question, which is, okay, is there any correlation at all between the bits of your job that you enjoy and the bits that you're really good at? And everybody, pretty much without exception, says, duh, of course. So it's really fascinating to know that justifiable confidence is not a black and white thing, and that quite possibly you, with certain parts of your job, you're far more down the justifiable confidence end, and with other bits, maybe not, you know, total fake it till you make it, but maybe a little bit more down towards that end than you are the justifiable confidence end. And so we decided that we should do something about this to see if it were possible to help people with this whole phenomenon. And so back in 2023, we decided to sit down and see if it would be possible to put together a model for creating internal communication practices which could give everybody justifiable confidence in them. Wow, could that be done? And it took us 4 months, from the middle of July to the middle of November. And eventually we put it together. We thought, this is amazing. This is so cool. Imagine what we'll be able to do, what we'll be able to share with people. And we were just about to go live with it and hey, everybody, we can give you justifiable confidence in all your working practices, when suddenly, ironically enough, we had a crisis of confidence. Because we just imagined that, okay, you go to the world, you go to the internal communication community saying, we can give you justifiable confidence in all your working practices. How cool is that? And no doubt some people would say, yes, fantastic, bring it on. But then we could also envisage a whole bunch of internal communication specialists absolutely losing it and saying, how dare you? How dare you suggest my confidence isn't already justifiable? Look at my job title. Look at my years of experience. Look at my track record. Look at my qualifications. And you tell me my confidence isn't justifiable? Go away. And so we thought, okay, we must be missing something here. What is it we're missing? And so when we gave it a little more thought, we realized, because these people who would be saying, how dare you suggest my confidence is justifiable, are also people who we find on LinkedIn on a regular basis complaining about not having all the leadership influence they want. We must be missing. What is the blind spot here? And embarrassingly enough, it took us 5 months to spot it, because we finished the model in the middle of November 2023. It wasn't until the middle of April 2024 that the penny finally dropped, and we felt like such a Homer Simpson, because we thought, oh, good grief, hang on a second. It's obvious when you think about it that if you have justifiable confidence in your team and your abilities and so on, and your leadership team are not giving you all the influence you want, surely it's because they're not using the same criteria as you are to determine whether they can have justifiable confidence in you. So if you are basing your justifiable confidence on criteria A, B, and C, and they are basing their justification of whether or not they can give you all the influence you want on criteria X, Y, and Z, then yeah, is it any wonder you're not having all the influence you want? So what we need to do is to bring those criteria together and make this justifiable confidence shareable. That's the key. And in fact, as soon as we got that, we realized, well, actually, we've already done that. This model that we've created, which we called the justifiable confidence model, it turns out it's actually a shareable justifiable confidence model. So if we can do this, and you can have justifiable confidence in yourself and your team and everything you're doing, and your leadership team can share in that justifiable confidence, bingo, that's how you get all the influence you need. The question is, how do you actually make it shareable? What's it going to take? What are the criteria that you need to share? And so the starting point for this is what we could call fitness for purpose. Because we would say that, well, let's flip it on its head and say, just imagine that you had a whole series of working practices, briefing process, language standards, channel mix, feedback systems, whatever. And if any of those practices were unfit for purpose, well, obviously your leadership team aren't going to be able to have justifiable confidence in them. So unfit for purpose is clearly out the window. We cannot have that. It needs to be fit for purpose. But what specifically is it that needs to be fit for purpose? We will be digging into fitness for purpose in a lot of detail in session 2, because there's a lot to it. But for now, let's just recognize a number of sort of headline things that need to be fit for purpose. First of all, we would say there is the design of your working practices. So if you have, let's say, your briefing process, that you would have a template of questions, a comprehensive template that you always take people through to gather all the information you need. That would be an aspect of the practice design, which everyone could know, yes, that template of questions is fit for purpose. So that's point number one. But of course, that wouldn't be enough on its own, because we all know that just because you ask someone a question doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to give you a valid answer to it all the time, does it? So it's not enough just that you have the right questions, but your team also need the skills to be able to evaluate the answers that they're getting from people and determine whether or not those answers are actually valid. Are they fit for purpose or not? And if not, to have the skills to follow up with appropriate questions to garner that information they need from their clients in a way that everyone can have justifiable confidence in. So practice design and skills, but then there's a third component to this, which if we go back to that influence poverty list, we'll see, just picking out one of these. And again, this may not be something that you have on your list, but just for the sake of illustration, let's imagine that you or someone else is in a situation where, you sit down to take a brief from a client and they do the old sort of, oh, sorry, I can only give you 5 minutes thing. Well, sorry, it doesn't matter how good your template of questions is. It doesn't matter how skilled you and your people are. There's no way you can take a fit for purpose brief in just 5 minutes. So it's not enough to have the design and the skills. You also need to have the mandate to use those practice designs and those skills every single time. And a lot of people, when they see this, they go, aha, yeah, that's the problem. We don't actually have the mandate to do this. That's why we don't have the influence. Well, yes and no, because you need to you can't just sort of say, I want that mandate, please. You have to give your leadership team justifiable confidence that you've earned that mandate, by having the practice designs and the skills to actually deliver on that mandate. And there's something else really insidious, yet another blind spot that so many people miss when it comes to the question of fitness for purpose, because they get so caught up in the idea of things being fit for purpose that they lose sight of the fact that, oh, hang on just a second. What if the purpose for which these practices are fit is actually an unfit purpose? Well, then you would have the most efficient and effective ways of producing the wrong results. So you have to know, and you have to be able to make sure that your leadership team can acknowledge that the purpose itself of internal communication is a valid purpose, which brings us really to the kind of the beginning that we need to get to. Julie Andrews once said, let's start at the very beginning, a very fine place to start. Well, we've kind of got there now, because the way we think this through is simply with a question when it comes to making sure that the purpose of internal communication is valid, is to ask, well, hang on a second, hang on. How is it possible for anybody to have justifiable confidence in the purpose of any given thing if you haven't first defined the thing which needs to have that purpose? That's where we need to go. That's the very beginning at which we need to start when it comes to building your leadership influence. And so this is what we're going to be getting into now, how we go about actually defining internal communication in such a way that everybody can have justifiable confidence in that definition, which we need to get absolutely crystal clear about, absolutely justifiably confident about before we start concerning ourselves with making things fit for the purpose of that thing. And it transpires that, well, an awful lot of organizations currently, it seems, don't have a definition of internal communication written down anywhere. It's not explicit. They don't. So how can you tell? Is that definition right? Is it not? Does it even exist? And if it doesn't, then maybe this is where we need to begin with a definition of internal communication. Or is it? Because an awful lot of people transpose the term internal communication and internal communications. And we are going to suggest that using the term internal communications isn't actually going to do your leadership influence any favors at all. Why not? Well, the thing is that people so often complain. Again, on LinkedIn, we see it week in, week out, people complaining about being used as a post box. And they whinge and moan about it, but they call themselves internal communications managers, or they work in internal communications departments. Well, internal communications are outputs or, activities. That's what internal communications are. So is it any wonder that if you call yourself an internal communications manager, people are just going to subliminally think, well, that's what they do. They are there to deliver outputs. They're there to manage activities. Whereas if you call yourself an internal communication manager, well, no one's going to think that you're responsible for just producing one output or managing one activity, which means they have no choice but to think of internal communication as the business discipline. Now, it isn't going to guarantee that they do that, but we can guarantee that as long as you leave the S on the end of a job title or a department title, it is pretty much guaranteeing, it's cementing in place in people's minds this unconscious notion that you are responsible only for producing outputs and managing activities. And that ain't going to do you any favors when it comes to the kind of influence that you want. Are you ever going to be put in a position where you're able to establish and adequately influence business policies for the way internal communication is practiced if people are still thinking, well, they're only responsible for producing outputs? So that's not going to do you any favors. So even though removing the S from any job title or department title. If it's there, it may not be. But if it is, if you remove it, that won't be enough to get you all the influence you want. But if you leave it in place, it's pretty much guaranteed to stop you getting as far as you want to. So we need to change the way in which people are thinking about internal communication in a way that maybe they haven't thought about it before. Because we're just going to give you an example here of something that we experienced a few years ago when we were working with an organization that had got itself into such a pickle over internal communication, influence that they didn't have, that they wanted, and so on. And while we were working with them, a big hoo-ha blew up over a particular communication project that had happened and had gone horribly, horribly wrong. And so this wasn't part of what we were brought in to talk to them about, but we just happened to be working with them at the time. And and so we sat down with the internal communication team and asked them about this thing, because it had been such a big deal in the organization. And we said, so what went wrong with this communication? Why did it go wrong? And they said, well, we weren't involved in it. And we said, okay, well, why not? Well, because it wasn't an internal communication. Oh, right. So, but it was about the company pension scheme, wasn't it? Yeah, it was. And so, it wasn't an internal communication about the company pension scheme. What? Oh, right. So the company pension scheme, it's managed by an external company. No, it's managed by the HR team, the pensions admin function within HR. All right. So this was a communication that was coming from people inside the organization. Yeah, but it wasn't an internal communication. No. Right, because yeah, we get it, because obviously it could have been going to people who've left the company now, and they are no, it's only going to, because people who leave the company aren't able to contribute to the pension scheme anymore. What? Right, so this was a communication that was coming solely from people inside the organization and going solely to people inside the organization. Yes, it was. Right, so it was an internal communication. Now, what? No, it was an HR communication. Yeah, right. Okay. We clearly have a problem here, don't we? Because it seems that an awful lot of people are making an awful lot of mistakes when it comes to the way they are defining internal communication. And many people unwittingly are defining it on the basis that, okay, it's a sort of flawed syllogism. They're working out isn't really hanging together, because what they tell themselves, and this is so common since we came across this, we realized so many internal communication teams do this. They define internal communication as follows. So my team does internal communication. Therefore, internal communication is what my team does. Therefore, if my team doesn't do it, it isn't internal communication. Oh, for goodness sake. Are you serious? This is extraordinary. And yet, if you think about it, you can kind of understand it. Because if they didn't define it like this, then they could end up getting it in the neck for all sorts of other communication foul-ups that other people are doing, but that the internal communication function isn't responsible for. However, what it does mean is that they are actually limiting their own internal communication leadership influence, because they're defining internal communication on the basis solely of their own remit, rather than defining internal communication as the business discipline. That's where they're going wrong. They're not actually recognizing the whole discipline and defining internal communication on the basis of everything it is, which means currently you've got no room to grow into if you base it solely on your remit. And what makes it even more challenging is that very often internal communication teams and internal communication specialists, and in fact, even the Institute of Internal Communication itself, can actually conflate and confuse these two and define internal communication on the basis of both of these things almost at the same time. And if you think we're about to have a go at the Institute of Internal Communication, you need to remember we were one of the founding directors of the IOIC. So, we're not having a go. If anyone's to blame for this, look here, because it's something we could have and perhaps should have sorted out when it was launched back in 2010, except for what? Well, we're a human being. We've got blind spots too. We missed this at the time. And it means that even today, the IOIC is confusing people with different or potentially conflicting definitions of internal communication. This was one of its flagship communications from 2023, the IC Index. It comes out each year. And within this particular publication, there was this quote that said, team leaders are being asked to do a lot, especially in the communications space. Well, leaving aside the fact that it's saying communications, we will, kind of let that slide for now. What this is saying is that internal communication obviously is so much more than just the internal communication team does. It's something that team leaders do, communicating with their teams, and their teams communicating with their team leaders. It's something everybody does. And this is being, explicitly or certainly implicitly said in this particular quote. And yet, in this same publication, there's a second quote that says it's important for the tone of voice, messaging, and content formats are right to cut through noise. Now, this is something, again, we see so often on LinkedIn, the number of posts that go up about the need for internal communication to cut through the noise. Fine. Let's just pause for a moment and ask this question. What noise? What is the noise through which internal communication has to cut, if not the noise of all of those other people doing all their internal communication? Which means that according to the Institute of Internal Communication must cut through the noise of internal communication. And we wonder why leaders don't know if they're taking internal communication seriously enough. How can they possibly answer that if the definition of internal communication is such a shambolic mess? Honestly, it's crazy, is it not? We need to tidy this up. You have to tidy this up if your leaders are ever going to be able to give you the influence you want. So how are we going to do that? Well, we're going to say, flat out, under no circumstances anymore can you afford to define internal communication on the basis solely of your remit, for two very good reasons. Firstly, because as we've already established, if you base it solely on your remit and different people in different parts of the organization can decide to use you or not use you, that means your remit can change moment to moment on the whims of a pensions administrator or an HR manager or an IT specialist or something. It's never going to be stable. And if you have an unstable definition, you can't have a stable purpose. And if it hasn't got a stable purpose, how can anybody, including your leaders, have justifiable confidence that you're doing things in a way which is fit for a purpose which is so unstable? So, you have to have, starting with a stable definition of internal communication, which your remit really can't ever be. And not only that, but the very fact that you're here because you want more leadership influence, well, let's just think this through for a second. What would happen if you actually achieved that, if you got more leadership influence? What would happen to your remit? It would change, wouldn't it? So again, you can't base the definition of internal communication on your remit, which you don't want to be what it is at the moment. We have to base the definition on the internal communication discipline, because only then is that going to give you the headroom to grow into. Will there be the gap between your remit as it is at the moment and what it could be and what you want it to be, so you can grow into that bigger picture, that grander vision of what you want your role to be and what you want your career to be about. So we have to start by defining internal communication as a business discipline, and we need to do it in a way in which everybody can share justifiable confidence, which means we have to do something else. It's not enough merely to define internal communication. We also need to show everybody the workings out. Why is it defined like this? Why can they have justifiable confidence in this definition of internal communication? And one of the things that we realized when we started thinking through, okay, how do we do this? Several years ago, we were having something to eat with the brilliant Lizzie Barrett. If you've never heard of Lizzie Barrett, she's definitely someone that's worth checking out. And we were talking about defining internal communication. She looked at us and said, well, surely you need to define communication first before you start concerning yourself with internal communication. And of course, it was another Homer Simpson moment. We knew she was absolutely right. So that's where we're going to start, by defining what we mean by communication when it relates to the way it is conducted inside an organization. And so this is how we define communication when it's being conducted internally. It is the exchange of information between two or more intelligences, whether human, artificial, or both. We used to say it was exchange of information between two or more human beings, but then AI has meant that, well, we needed to refine that or add the extra bit in. But the key thing here is exchange. Why does that matter? Because that's not how it's meant when it's used for external comms. Marketing communications, PR, they're not an exchange of information. They're not meant to be. They're about, just delivering messages, essentially. And it's perfectly valid. It's perfectly okay for that to be the case when it's external, because external communications are happening in an open environment where those communications can be received by pretty much anybody, and that's fine, because whilst the communicators may have paid for the, let's say, the advertising space in this particular example, well, yeah. However, if you receive those communications, have those people had to pay you for the time you spend receiving them? No, your time comes for free when you're an external audience. But when it's internal communication and you just waste time of people who don't need to receive them, you're simply burning the organization's money, because your organization has to pay for every moment of the internal audience's time. So it's not the same. And that means that when it comes to the whole issue of whether or not people are going to act on communications which they did need to receive, well, okay, let's say it's external. Again, the option to have received or not received is actually with the audience. But if they do receive those communications and they decide, well, this theatre play, I'm not into that, I don't have time for that. Or when it comes to a new car, well, I haven't got the money for a new car. External audiences, if they do not have the resources needed to act on the communications they're receiving, that's their problem. But if it's an internal communication and a member of an internal audience that needed to receive the communication, so their time wasn't being wasted, they needed to receive it, and they don't have the resources to act on it, that's not their problem. That's the organization's problem, which is why it has to be an exchange of information. You have to know all the time, are people up for doing what's being asked of them? Are they actually in a position to do what's being asked of them? And you cannot simply deliver a message, unlike external comms, and expect yourself to be able to say, right, I have communicated. No, internally, all you've done is broadcast something. But you need to know whether or not the internal audience is in a position to act on what's being asked of them or what they're being told to do. That's why internally it has to be an exchange of information. And now we're clear about that, we can go on to defining what we mean by internal communication as a business discipline. And we define it as follows. And of course, because everyone needs to have justifiable confidence in it, we will show you our workings out. So we define it as being all communicating that's going on inside an organization, which is prompting or enabling employees to directly or indirectly fulfill that organization's reason for existing. That is our definition of internal communication. But why are we defining it like that? First of all, what's this indirectly thing about? Why are we saying it has to directly or indirectly fulfill the organization's reason for existing? Well, because an awful lot of perfectly legitimate internal communications are nothing to do with the business's core activities. There need to be plenty of internal communications that are telling employees how to claim expenses or book holidays or report a broken piece of equipment or follow health and safety procedures. All of those things that people need to be able to do, employees need to be able to do in order to be able to perform at work, but which are not actually to do with directly delivering on the organization's reason for existing. So that's why the indirectly is there. But why does it need to be about fulfilling that organization's reason for existing? Well, because if it weren't, then it risks including all sorts of social chit chat, which is not appropriate to include. So, people get in from the weekend and asking one of their colleagues, okay, how did your daughter's play go at the weekend? Or is your mum's shoulder getting better? And all those sorts of things. With social animals, of course, we're going to have those conversations, but they are not appropriate to include within the definition of internal communication, are they? Of course they're not. But there are some sort of semi-social communications that are a bit like this, but they're actually a little bit different, because those water cooler conversations that people can have, which are related to the organization fulfilling its reason for existing, they're not formal communications. So you can't say whether or not these conversations are fit for purpose. That's not an appropriate question to ask. There is no formal briefing process that happens beforehand. People are not following formal language standards. We're having these conversations and so on. They're fit for purpose, but they are nonetheless sort of internal communications in that they relate to the organization fulfilling its reason for existing directly or indirectly. And these are the sorts of conversations that very often you want to encourage. So you get employees really involved and the employee voice can start to come through, but you don't actually sort of start saying, okay, we need to lay down the law on how those conversations are happening. One would hope that provided the raw material with which people are having those conversations, the formal communications they've received beforehand, which are stimulating these conversations, they need to be fit for purpose so that these conversations can be as productive as possible. So that's why we distinguish between these two different forms, if you like, of informal or social communication, and why, with that clear, we would stand by this definition of internal communication. If you have views on it and you think we should be changing it, refining it, then please, let us know, as long as you show us your workings out. Them's the rules of the game, okay? But if this is the definition of internal communication, then what are the implications of this as far as your leadership influence are concerned? Well, it gets really fascinating. The first thing that this definition tells us is that internal communication is providing pretty much all of the raw material, well, not all the raw, sorry, much of the raw material with which people are thinking about their work. A lot of that raw material can come from their professional training. People working in finance will have trained as accountants, and that will be telling them how to do a lot of their work. However, when it comes to their priorities, and when it comes to any kind of organization-specific ways of doing things, that information is coming to people through internal communication. It's providing a lot of that raw material, which means that internal communication is significantly responsible for the quality and efficiency of pretty much every other business activity. There isn't anything going on inside your organization which isn't being influenced to some extent by internal communication. And that's really important to recognize. Internal communication is arguably the most influential business activity of them all, which becomes even more important to recognize when we accept that because everybody communicates at least with their boss and very often with colleagues and other peers, it means that every single person in your organization is an internal communication practitioner. And that has real implications for you when it comes to, well, hang on a second, why should they pay attention to what you're saying? So you need to be clear about how you define yourself in the eyes of other people. And we would recommend that you describe yourself not as a practitioner, but as an internal communication specialist. Now, some people want to use the word professional, an internal communication professional. We have a real, as you can probably guess from our tone of voice, a real problem with that term. Partly because it's a bit corporate bullshitty, to be honest. And also because, well, if everybody is communicating at work, then anyone could argue that, well, I am paid money to do internal communication, therefore I am an internal communication professional. But they will never be able to call themselves an internal communication specialist unless they actually are, because they are not. They are an IT specialist, an HR specialist, a customer care specialist. They are not an internal communication specialist. So that is a designation which can make a clear dividing line between you and them, which is really important when you recognize that because everybody is an internal communication practitioner, it creates two really critical truth gaps in people's minds that they're not necessarily conscious of, they are carrying around inside them. And the first of these is enshrined in the phrase, anyone can do it. Now, if you think about it, not everybody at work manages people. Not everyone manages budgets or IT systems or does sales or in fact, there is no business activity that everybody does except for internal communication. And therefore, internal communication is the only business activity about which the phrase anyone can do it is literally true. It has to be, because everybody does do it. However, as we all know, the phrase anyone can do it also has a colloquial meaning, does it not? If someone were to say, come on, anyone can do that, what they mean by implication is that it takes no specialist skills or insights to do it as well as anybody else, which is why an awful lot of people may not be taking you as seriously as you want, because they believe, wrongly of course, but they believe that they could do your job if they wanted to. It's just they're far too busy doing other things. Thank you very much. So we need to understand how to change this dynamic, which we will be getting into in a lot of detail in session 2. But before we do that, we need to consider a second blind spot, which is waiting to catch people out if they fall through that first truth gap between the literal truth and the colloquial falsehood of the phrase anyone can do it. Because when they tell themselves that, they then can end up telling themselves, in that case, I should be good at internal communication because anyone can do it. Well, should, again, is ambiguous. It can be interpreted in a number of different ways, 2 of which are particularly important, have massive implications for the need for you to have all the influence that you want. Because let's just take a couple of examples. Okay, let's imagine that someone's saying to you, okay, on a crowded train, you should give up your seat for a pregnant woman, shouldn't you? Well, yeah, of course you should. And in those circumstances, the meaning of the should, what it's implying is a sense of duty or obligation, as it were. So that's one meaning of should. Now, let's look at a different scenario. Let's just imagine that, someone is going away for the weekend. They're flying from London to Paris, and they're not sure about how much time to allow for the flight. And so they ask you, or you or someone else who knows about these things says, well, a flight from London to Paris, that should take about an hour, shouldn't it? Oh, it should take about an hour. Are we saying it has a duty and obligation to take an hour? No. That's not what we mean. In those circumstances, what we mean is it would be reasonable to expect that it probably will take about an hour. So we have these 2 very different meanings of should. On the one hand, duty, obligation, and on the other, a sense of reasonable expectation. So when people are telling themselves they should be good at internal communication, which of those 2 meanings are they paying attention to? Do they actually mean both, or just one or the other? And which of them is true? Well, it's certainly true that people have a duty and obligation to be skilled at internal communication, particularly if they're managers or leaders, because it's a key part of their job for which they're being paid good money and which everyone else is relying on them to be good at. But is the expectation reasonable? Now, they may tell themselves that if they'd said, well, anyone can do it, but is that really true? Or is there an element of cross their fingers and hope going on? Are they having to fake it till they make it? Let's just think through what could possibly make it reasonable for them to expect themselves to be good at internal communication. We've worked out 3 different possibilities here. For the first of them, we need to go back to 2003, when the human genome was first mapped, and all the people who did it got the Nobel Prize and so on. And one of the fascinating things that people discovered when it was mapped was there seemed to be huge swathes of DNA that didn't seem to be doing anything, which is a bit of a weird thing because nature abhors a vacuum. So there's loads of research that's been done subsequently to try and understand, well, what are these, this DNA, what's it doing? And from time to time, there would be, and certainly in the first few years, there would be an announcement on the news where they'd use colloquial terms for different new gene identifications that have come up with, like the skinny gene and the smart gene and the ginger gene and whatever. But it wasn't until 2020 when they discovered something rather fascinating. And unfortunately, because it was 2020 and the pandemic was going on, then all the other medical news just kind of got shoved to the side. Because what had been discovered was something which is quite remarkable. It's unique to the human genome. It is the internal communication gene. And it's unique to humans. And the way it works is it stays dormant, while we're growing up. But the moment someone leaves school or university and goes out to work, this gene will kick in at that moment. And it enables anybody to just instinctively know, because it's part of their DNA. They just know exactly how to identify what needs communicating to whom, when, and how in any business situation they ever encounter without anyone ever having to teach them. It's brilliant, isn't it? Yeah, it doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. Everybody knows it doesn't exist. However, pretty much every organization on the planet behaves as if it did exist because people are expected to just know how to do it without being taught. It's nonsense. Oh, hang on. Or are they? What about, hang on, no. What about all of those training courses people can go on? There's writing skills and presentation skills and interpersonal skills, all of those business communication training courses. Yeah, that's fine. Until you look at what are those courses actually teaching people. What they're teaching people is how to execute communications, not how to identify what, if anything, needs communicating in the first place. Which means that, well, hang on, if people haven't got an internal communication gene, which they haven't, and if the training courses aren't cutting it, which they aren't, that means that pretty much everybody, through no fault of their own, has been backed into this disempowering corner where they actually have a duty to fulfill an unreasonable expectation. Good grief, how are they supposed to cope with that? Oh, hang on a second. Maybe, what if they faked it till they made it, or they crossed their fingers and hoped? Can you see how all of this kind of works out? It's no one's fault. This is the point. No one's to blame for this. It's simply the situation we've all inherited from those who came before us. So how do people cope with it? Well, it seems that they either, just shut their eyes and ignore it, or most people will, through time, work it out for themselves, try to become better as they work their way through their career, essentially by the only means available to them, because they can't do it via the training courses and they can't use their DNA. So they have to just rely on essentially trial and error. That's it. That's the best case scenario. And of course, trial and error has two components to it. The first being trial, and the second leading us to an inconvenient and inescapable truth, which is the most influential of all business activities in your organization has at least some error hardwired in, not by design, but by default. That's the point. It's nobody's fault. No one is to blame for this. No one needs to feel bad or ashamed or guilty or defensive. It's simply the situation we have all inherited from those who came before us, who inherited it from the people before them, and so on and so forth. But it does mean that when it comes to your leadership influence, you have a very strong case now for saying, hang on a second, this situation is not doing anyone any favors. And you having this influence poverty, whereby you can't actually make the kind of impact on the way in which internal communication is conducted in your organization, is not something that can be defended on any kind of logical basis at all. And instead, you need to have the kind of influence abundance that we're talking about. This is why it has to happen. This is the starting of your argument about getting the influence you need. But there's an awful lot more to say about it, because we've only just sort of begun, as it were. It's taken us a long time to get here. But in the next session, we will be looking at how you can back your leaders from that disempowering corner into an empowering corner where they're giving you all the influence you want and need. And then in the third session, we will look at how you can put together a compelling business case and an action plan to make it happen. Now, both of these sessions are available already to watch online, so you can go straight there. These images that you're seeing are not what you'll see on the platform, because with the platform that we're using has taken quite a while for us to get used to. And so what you'll actually see is just our image on both of those. So we're putting the link to both of these sessions in the comments, because you won't find it by looking for the images. So if you go to the comments, you'll find the link and you'll be able to go either straight there or book some time in your calendar to come back and do session 2 and session 3. If you have any questions about what we've shared with you during this session, then do leave us a DM or send us put a comment in the comment section. And if you've enjoyed this session, if you found it useful, then again, leave us a comment, give us a like, and share this session with your network, because the more internal communication specialists who get this, who understand this, the more impact internal communication can have on improving the quality of life for employees in pretty much every organization on the planet, but also because the employees will be being more efficient and effective, they'll be working more elegantly, they will have more justifiable confidence in the way they're doing what they're doing, they will have a better impact on the external stakeholders of their organization, which means you are in a position to start helping make the quality of life better for everybody on the planet, whether they go to work or not. And that's surely something that everyone would be grateful to you for. So thank you so much for your time. As you say, you've got any thoughts or comments, then leave them for us and we will pick them up with you. And we hope that we will catch you in the next session. Thank you so